This is the capsule of a bullet that I got when I went to a shooting range in North Carolina in the summer of 2016. I gave said bullet to my Valentine.
I defy you, Heartman!
Hey guys, RanterInShades here, exercise my first amendment rights vlog style, and it's time for a Valentine's Day themed episode of What's Wrong With.
What's wrong with me? You wanna know what's wrong with me? I can ask you the exact same thing. What's wrong with me?
If you're watching this, there's a high chance that you're a fan of metal, and by that I mean it's a 100% chance. I don't know why it would be lower than that. So I'm going to open this video with a question that you're free to answer. What is the most popular genre of metal? Now, I imagine that question is going to bring up a series of follow-up questions like, how is metal being defined here? The answer to that should be obvious if you follow my channel. How are we measuring popularity here? Are we talking in terms of record sales, streaming numbers, chart performance, social media followers, the magnitude of their tours? What? Are we talking most popular of all time or most popular currently? Are we talking most popular worldwide or just in the US? Are we talking in terms of the amount of bands playing it? What are you talking about, you fucking weirdo in shades? Why is your question so goddamn vague? All perfectly valid questions. Metal as a whole is a genre of music that I consider quite popular. It has a very wide fan base spanning all across the globe, and a number of different bands the genre has to offer are very big names in music that meet the criteria laid out in those questions. I think you can make an argument for just about any of metal's subgenres being the most popular. Glam metal was hugely popular in the 80s with a lot of big hits to its name. Nu metal was big in the 90s and early 2000s. Thrash metal has a really big and strong community.
Fucking fire!
You'd be surprised at the number of power and symphonic metal bands that exist around the world. Hell, traditional metal is pretty all-encompassing, so an argument could even be made for that being the most popular that I'd be pretty inclined to agree with. But the genre of metal that I believe fits the description of most, if not all of those questions, is metalcore. Metalcore is an immensely omnipresent genre of metal and has been for at least 20 years. After nu metal's commercial heyday, this was the definitive metal sound that was attracting a whole new generation of fans. And it's still hugely omnipresent. It seems that most of the hottest up-and-coming metal bands that I hear about play some variant of metalcore. Whether we're talking general metalcore, progressive metalcore like Invent, Animate, and Spiritbox, electronicore like Palisades and Electric Callboy, bands like Knocked Loose and Code Orange that toe the line into hardcore punk, bands like Tala and Ocean Grove fusing metalcore with nu metal to create nu metalcore, or even a band like Loathe playing with baritone guitars and incorporating shoegaze elements into their sound. No matter which direction you look in, metalcore is the big thing in metal right now that's attracting much of its hype. And with how long its omnipresence in metal has lasted, I think it's safe to say that its popularity has surpassed that of all the other metal genres. Of course, to a portion of the metal audience, that's a bad thing. Along with glam metal and nu metal, metalcore was, and still is, one of the biggest, if not the biggest, target of metal elitist ire. They hated the omnipresence. They hated how over the top the genre got musically. They hated the hardcore influence. They hated the vocals. They hated the image the bands tended to go with, and they hated the fan base. If you've been following this channel for a long time, you'll know that I've had a history of ripping into those kinds of arguments against these bands' legitimacy and credibility within metal. But much like I said at the beginning of my Motley Crue video, for as much as metalcore was widely hated by this part of the metal community, there were plenty of bands that I would see exceptions being made for. Bands like All That Remains, Shadows Fall, Trivium, Unearth, Parkway Drive, Converge, and even As I Lay Dying, both before and after Tam Lambesis' conviction and eventual pulling the rug out from underneath, are the names that tend to come to mind first when asked about who the best metalcore bands are that even people that generally don't like the genre can get behind. But of course, their adulation pales in comparison to Killswitch Engage, who many see as having written the blueprint for the metalcore sound as we know it today. With the impeccable melodic riffing from Adam Dukovics, their catchy writing, slick production, and passionate vocals from both Jesse Leach and Howard Jones, it's not difficult at all to understand why Killswitch is seen as the definitive metalcore band. But they're not my favorite. There's one name that I left out from that list of bands seen as the best in metalcore. But what if I told you they were also one of the metalcore bands that got bashed the most throughout their career? When we think of the most common targets of dissent within metalcore, bands like Ask and Alexandria, Fallen in Reverse, Amur, Attila, and even bands I like Motionless in White, Of Mice and Men, and The Devil Wears Prada come to mind first. But the band we're discussing today has been pretty split down the middle between these two sides throughout my time listening to them, to the point where, similar to what I said in my Korn video, I wasn't sure if they even qualified for a video in this series anymore. For as much as there were many metal fans that didn't take kindly to this band when they first came on the scene, they're seen today as being right up with Killswitch as being the band with the definitive metalcore sound. And for as long as I've been listening to metalcore, they've also been my personal favorite in the genre. This band is Bullet for My Valentine. Now you know why this is being uploaded on Valentine's Day. It's been a while since I've done that, hasn't it? Technically speaking, my first taste of metalcore came from All That Remains and Shadows Fall, both having bonus songs in Guitar Hero 2, with Six and The Light That Blinds respectively, along with Killswitch Engage having My Curse as a bonus song in Guitar Hero 3. While I love all of those songs, and while they were instrumental in getting me to look more into all three of those bands, who fun fact are all from Massachusetts, Bullet for My Valentine, or Bullet as I'll be calling them throughout this video, though not to be confused with the Swedish band that Razorfist featured in his new wave of traditional heavy metal video, was the metalcore band I gravitated to the most when I was beginning my venturing into the different areas of metal. While I enjoy a variety of metal genres, my taste tends to skew a little more towards the more melodic genres where lead guitar work is more emphasized, as well as the ones with more of a catchy appeal, and that was definitely the case when I was a teenager and my musical exploration had really begun to take off. I wasn't big into harsh vocals at the time either, and it would take a year or so before I would develop the appreciation for them that I have now, so Bullet for My Valentine was the perfect gateway here. The thing that I've always really loved about Bullet is that they're the kind of metal band that has a sound where there's something for everyone. When we think of metalcore, we think of an abundance of scream vocals, big clean choruses, and massive chuggy breakdowns. While much of those elements are present in Bullet's sound, they're one of the few bands that makes a point to stray away from that typical metalcore sound. The writing is more tasteful, Matt Tuck isn't as scream-heavy of a vocalist compared to others in the scene, often opting to be more clean-focused, and most intriguing of all, there's some thrilling lead guitar work from Michael Paget. One of the common complaints about metalcore is that there isn't a lot of guitar solos, often complaining that the breakdowns have replaced solos, but Page spits in the face of that. This is why Bullet is the band I right away recommend for people that are either new to metalcore or have yet to be sold on the sound or the musicianship. Because even if you're someone that prefers the aggression in thrash metal or death metal, or the melodic appeal of traditional metal or power metal, Bullet appeals to both of those sensibilities, so they are not a hard band to get into, and that's a big part of why they've always been my favorite metalcore band. Metalcore is quite literally a fusion of metal and hardcore. The concept existed as early as the 80s with the advent of thrash metal. Thrash metal already took a good deal of influence from hardcore punk bands like Black Flag, The Misfits, and The Bad Brains, which is the main reason why I've never understood why metal elitists complain about metalcore fusing metal with hardcore and having that be their justification for why it isn't true metal, when thrash metal bands were essentially doing the same thing. Maybe to them the thrash bands did it better, nothing wrong at all with having that opinion, but by all technicality, they both had the same general idea. Along with that, you also had crossover thrash bands like Suicidal Tendencies and Dirty Rotten Imbeciles upping the ante with the hardcore influence by fusing the already hardcore-influenced thrash metal with more hardcore punk. Yes, it's as wild as it sounds. As more of metal subgenres began to develop in the 80s, particularly with the rise of death metal and growled vocals, hardcore bands began implementing more of the heavy elements into their sound. Bands like Agnostic Front and Sick of It All are some of the heaviest hardcore bands from the 80s I can name. And in the 90s, while bands like Bad Religion, NoFX, Rich Kids on LSD, aka RKL, and my personal favorite, Strung Out, emphasized the speedy and even melodic aspects of hardcore punk, bands like Earth Crisis, Integrity, Madball, and Ringworm took that heavy hardcore sound from the 80s a little further. The band that's seen by many as the one to have invented metalcore is Converge, who also happen to be from Massachusetts. Yeah, if the Dropkick Murphys segment of the Most Unexpected Music Source video didn't do enough to show my masshole pride, I think this portion of the video definitely will, with how essential the scene was over here for metalcore's development. When Converge released their 1994 debut, Halo in a Haystack, it was like nothing that any hardcore act before them had done before. There were some hardcore bands that were pretty heavy in the 80s and early 90s, but none that took as prominent of a metal influence as Converge. In addition to metal, they also brought influences from post-hardcore to the table, which gave their sound a lot more complexity. While metal and hardcore didn't always have a history of getting along in the 80s, this marrying of the two not only united the two worlds, but also brought something entirely new to metal at a time when the genre was really starting to go to town on experimenting. But the next major development came a year later in the form of the Gothenburg melodic death metal band At the Gates releasing their fourth album, Slaughter of the Soul, whose title track is a song old school viewers might recognize from one of Official GATG's old intros. They had built up some modest momentum in the early 90s, but this album not only made them a band to take note of, it not only played a key developing role in what we now know as melodic death metal, but the sound on this album was so captivating that bands from the growing hardcore scenes in places like New York and Boston got the idea to pull from its sound, hence why Finn McKenty has referred to this wave of metalcore bands popping up in the late 90s and early 2000s as At the Gates core. Just from that one clip I played, you can easily tell how important At the Gates was to metalcore's development because the similarities are that uncanny. While some might view these bands as ripping At the Gates off, I see it as taking what they were doing and combining it with the general idea that Converge had of converging metal with hardcore to come out with something really cool and exciting to take into the new millennium. The early 2000s are often associated with nu metal and pop punk as far as rock of the time goes. But another thing heavily associated with the time by metal fans is what the media dubbed the new wave of American heavy metal. Much like how the term nu metal was created to refer to the new metal bands that were coming on the scene at the time, fusing metal with alternative genres, with how far metal as a whole had come in its development since the 80s, a term like that sounds almost necessary for the direction metal was going, let alone here in the States. While nu metal was scoffed at by a lot of metal fans for how corny the bands would get, bands like Machine Head, Soulfly, and
Lamb of God
brought some Pantera-esque and thrash-inspired bite to the scene, and along with the metalcore bands coming out that were taking influence from the Gothenburg death metal sound, brought more emphasis back to the riffs and grooves. Metalcore's rise felt slow and gradual in the first part of the 2000s, but with albums like Killswitch Engage's Alive or Just Breathing, As I Lay Dying's Frail Words Collapse, Norma Jean's Bless the Martyr and Kiss the Child, and of course Converge's highly acclaimed album Jane Doe coming out, it really hit the ground running. The groundwork was laid for some of the genre's most classic albums to come out soon after, like The End of Heartache and As Daylight Dies from Killswitch Engage, with Howard Jones now fronting the band, Ascendancy and The Crusade from Trivium, All That Remains The Fall of Ideals, Shadows Falls The War Within, and even Every Time I Die's Gutter Phenomenon. But something truly special was about to emerge from across the pond. Bullet for My Valentine was originally formed in Wales in 1998 by Matt Tuck, Michael Paget, bassist Nick Crandall, and drummer Michael Moose Thomas. Originally, the band was called Jeff Killed John, which sounds like either a reference to some obscure horror movie or the band just trying to be random and edgy for the lulz. Like, who are Jeff and John supposed to be? They released a few EPs under this name before Crandall left and was replaced by Jason J. James. It was also around this time that they changed their name to Bullet for My Valentine, which had more of a fancy appeal to it and is considerably less dumb-sounding than Jeff Killed John. Record labels began to see potential in the band following this, and after signing with Sony BMG, they released their self-titled EP in 2004, which would essentially get reissued a year later in the US via the hardcore-centered label Trustkill Records as their Hand of Blood EP. Hand of Blood was actually the first song of Bullets that I remember listening to, and I remember being really taken in by the riffs and guitar harmonies, or guitarmonies. Again, as someone that was mostly listening to a lot of classic metal around this time, I found what Bullet was doing on this song to be very tasteful. And along with that, the EP gave everyone a good taste of what was to come on their debut full-length. I've mentioned a lot of classic metalcore albums throughout this video, albums that still hold up really well today. But in my humble opinion, The Poison is my pick for the definitive metalcore album. If Killswitch laid the groundwork for what we know as the metalcore sound, particularly with bands like As I Lay Dying, Parkway Drive, August Burns Red, Underoath, Unearth, and even The Devil Wears Prada enlisting Adam Dukovic to produce for them, The Poison solidified the sound. It's a highly melodic album with some of the juiciest guitar tones of the decade, which was probably the biggest thing that got the band to click with me. And as I said earlier in the video, it's not super scream heavy. Matt Tuck reserves his screams only for the climactic moments in the songs, as well as when certain lyrics need some emphasis. And Jason J. James also utilizes his scream vocals as a way to counter or correspond to what Tuck is singing. There are even songs like Hit the Floor and All These Things I Hate Revolve Around Me, which some of you might remember as the transition song in Worst Songs of 2015, where the screaming is very minimal, but it's not in a way where the songs don't have a punch to them. It's incredibly tasteful, and again, makes for a great easing into the metalcore sound. And the songs are all bangers. It's one of those albums where it's really hard to pick out a track I don't care much for, because they all have so much character to them. I just can't get enough of the guitar work between Page and Tuck. If I had to pick the real standout favorites on this album, they'd be Four Words to Choke Upon, Hit the Floor, Room 409, the title track, 10 Years Today, Spit You Out, and of course, their signature song, Tears Don't Fall. This may be a really basic normie take, but Tears Don't Fall is my favorite song of Bullet's. While Hand of Blood and the other tracks I mentioned really rip hard and capture the fun aspects of metalcore, no song of Bullet's has the emotion and character that this one has. The riffs and melodies are all memorable, the ratio between the clean and screamed vocals is just right for this kind of song, it has the kind of pacing that ebbs and flows in a strong and tasteful manner, and of course, Padge's solo here is what really sold me on him being the band's X factor. This song is what set the band apart from the pack. There are some awesome metalcore bands out there, but none of them have a song like Tears Don't Fall in their repertoire, a song that's so lush and sensitive, but yet so big sounding with multiple climactic moments. It's also my favorite song to play in Drop C. The Poison became an instant classic, and Bullet quickly became a household name in metal. I didn't get into them until roughly a year after the album's release, around late 2007, early 2008, and they had definitely made a great impression on me. But let me tell you, the way I found out about their sophomore album, Scream Aim Fire, is still something I remember as being one of the funniest ways I've ever been surprised about an album release. It was through the title track being included in Guitar Hero World Tour, aka Guitar Hero 4. While it's not a game I hold in as high of regard as the first 3 games in Rock the 80s, the game had a lot of great songs in its soundtrack, many of which I was already familiar with by that point, as my music exploration was already well underway by the time of the game's release in 2008. But when I saw that Bullet for My Valentine had a song called Scream Aim Fire in the game that I had never heard before, I was like, "What's this?" And when I got to playing the song there, I was like,
What the fuck?
they put out a new album? How come I'm only finding out about it now? As you guys know, I have Guitar Hero as a series to thank for exposing me to a multitude of the bands I'm into today, but this was the first time I'd been taken aback by the knowledge that a band I had really taken a liking to had put out a new album featuring a song as wicked as this that I just didn't know about. I think back to that moment as being what really motivated me to aim to stay on top of new releases from my favorite bands, at least the ones I want to keep up with. Just from hearing that one song in the game, I could tell that they had really ramped up on this album, and I could not wait to sink my teeth into it. While The Poison had an all-around tasteful and accessible melodic metalcore sound, Scream Aim Fire is the album I would point to if you weren't convinced of how heavy the band could get, because it's probably their heaviest album. It's to the point where you could almost categorize it as being just as much of a thrash metal album as it is a metalcore album. If you were to argue that Scream Aim Fire is Bullet's best album on just that merit alone, it'd be hard for me to disagree. The Poison is the stronger overall album in my eyes, but this was the best following up to that album they could have come out with to really prove their legitimacy as a metal band, and that's always been my favorite thing about Scream Aim Fire. In addition to the title track, my favorites on here are the 2 other singles on the album, Hearts Burst Into Fire and Waking the Demon, along with Eye of the Storm, Disappear, Deliver Us From Evil, and End of Days. Their next album, Fever, came out at an interesting time. The year was 2010, and the metalcore scene had changed a fair bit compared to when Bullet first debuted. The mid to late 2000s were largely defined by the rise of social media. The internet in general was still a relatively new concept as a source for news and other assorted information, and even entertainment as well. But with sites like Facebook launching in 2004, Twitter in 2006, Instagram in 2010, Tumblr in 2007, and the very platform you're watching this video on, YouTube, in 2005, bands had a more direct way of connecting and communicating with their audience, as well as marketing and promoting their activity. But one site in particular that played a significant role in how bands rose to prominence was, of course, MySpace.
I took a bunch of pictures. You can see them on my MySpace page, along with my favorite songs and movies and things that other people have created but that I use to express my individualism.
If you're as old as me, you no doubt remember how prominent this website was in the culture of the time. And you might not believe it, but it actually still exists today. But I imagine most people watching probably have never heard of MySpace before, so to catch you up, it was a blogging site where you could customize your own profile and share photos, music, and other such content. And lots of bands in the 2000s, including Bring Me the Horizon and Panic at the Disco, reached stardom early on in their career largely through their utilization of this site. I myself never actually had a MySpace account, but even I'm aware of how big the MySpace scene was, especially for metalcore and deathcore bands. I always think of 2010 as the time when that scene really peaked. By this time, MySpace was losing its cultural relevance to the much more popular Facebook, but that MySpace throttle was what rang in the wave of metalcore acts coming out in the early 2010s referred to as the crapcore or scenecore bands. As I alluded at the beginning of the video, this era isn't looked at incredibly fondly, as most of the bands that were coming on the scene at the time were considered vapid and cringe, and it gave metalcore as a whole a not great look, which was disappointing to see at the time since this is when I was really starting to explore the genre more, with how much my friends at the camps I attended were really repping the genre hard, exposing me to the likes of Escape the Fate, We Came as Romans, and even A Day to Remember. And this isn't even mentioning the crunkcore bands that were getting unfairly lumped into this whole ordeal, simply because there was some audience overlap with the scene kids. It gives me such dizzying flashbacks just remembering how ridiculous this era got, but this kind of helped Fever to stick out from the pack. Compared to the Poison and Scream Aim Fire, Fever has a reputation of being a more mellow effort. The band wanted to not be as aggressive as they were on Scream Aim Fire, and were wanting to recapture the more catchy and accessible aspects of the Poison. As a result, I view the album as being a bridging gap between their really great albums and the ones I don't think of as being their strongest. The lead single and opening track, Your Betrayal, is a fun tune, and that vibe carries over on tracks like The Last Fight and Breaking Out, Breaking Down.
Don't take your eyes off the trigger. I'm not to blame if your world turns to black.
This is also the album where they incorporated more ballads, with my favorite being Bittersweet Memories. But it's not like Fever is a total departure from their classic sound, as songs like the title track, Dignity, Begging for Mercy, Pretty on the Outside, and my favorite on the album, Alone, rip pretty hard. As much as I look at Fever as being a good album from the band, I also see it as representing a bit of a theme that we're going to explore more once we get to the Debunking the Flat portion of the video. But before we get to that, while I normally like to keep things chronological in my What's Wrong With videos, I want to skip ahead a bit to talk about another one of my favorite albums of Bullet's, Venom. I remember being really excited for this album back in 2015, not just because I was anxious to see them rebound after their previous album that I'll talk more about later, but because I was really wowed by the album's first single, No Way Out. Venom is an album I view as really underrated in Bullet's discography, and I don't hear very many people talk about it. It's a shame because in my opinion, this is their best album since Scream Aim Fire, and it did an exceptional job at recapturing what so many people loved about the sound on their first two albums that fans felt was lost in their previous work.
There's no way out.
I still remember how awesome of a time I had listening to the album back in the summer of 2015, because it's another album where pretty much all the songs are total bangers, especially the aforementioned No Way Out, the title track, Skin, Hell or High Water, and Pariah. But Worthless and You Want a Battle, Here's a War really resonated hard with me, because this was also the year where I finally cut some really toxic people out of my life, and they both captured the fury and frustration that I felt at that time.
And I don't wanna hear that you're sorry. Your words mean nothing to me. I will not take this anymore. These words will never be ignored. You want a battle, here's a war.
Those are my two favorites on the album, and they're also some of my favorite Bullet for My Valentine songs in general. Venom made for a great emotional release, and as such, it's one of my favorite albums of 2015. Third behind State Champs Around the World and Back and Chon's Grow, and, the EP Gardens of Acadia put out that year, Red, Yellow, and Blue. I really wish more people gave this album some love, but regardless, it's one of my favorites from Bullet. But since the structure of this video is already weird enough, I think this is a good place to segue into the part where we debunk the flag. Oh god, I'm sorry, that was cringe, and that's probably not a good Matt Tuck impression. Doesn't help that I'm not Welsh. It's customary in this series for the bands I cover to have an album or group of albums that are seen as the mediocre ones. Bullet for My Valentine has two, 2013's Temper Temper and 2018's Gravity. The reason for this is because they're both a departure from the classic melodic metalcore sound everyone had come to love from them. But what I find to be really interesting about this is the fact that these weren't consecutive. I remember it was during my radio show in college where I first listened to some of Temper Temper, whose title totally isn't ripping off Danger Danger's shtick. So as some of you might know, I did radio in college. I had a weekly show called Shades Shenanigans, where I would turn my iTunes library on shuffle and create a playlist that lasted an hour some semesters and 2 hours in others, consisting of a wide variety of genres, which is something you guys know I take immense pride in being able to do. The radio station had a rule that during your show, you had to play at least 3 songs from the CDs that were sent by the labels they worked with that they called The Rack. My memory is a bit hazy about how this works, but from what I recall, the purpose of this was not only to expose DJs to new releases in the loud rock, indie, hip-hop, and even EDM fields, but it also contributed to how the station earns its money working with a company called College Music Journal, or CMJ, and reporting back to the labels and promoters what's being played. And once a semester, you also had to do a rack show, where you play only material from the rack. This was actually how I got introduced to the likes of The Contortionist, Fallujah, and Turnstile. Anyway, it was during one of my radio shows in 2013, or maybe it was still on the rack in 2014, I don't remember, that I saw that Bullet had an album on the rack. Usually my 3 rack songs, or the entirety of what I played on my rack shows, would be from bands I'm familiar with, and I was once again out of the loop on Bullet putting a new album out. When I played from Temper Temper on my show, it sounded different from what I was expecting. It didn't have the bite that the first 3 albums had, and it sounded mellower than even Fever did. This is what I meant when I said that Fever functioned as a bridging gap album because it seemed like a logical direction to go between a heavy album like Scream Aim Fire and this. I'm not going to say I hated what I heard, it just didn't really sound like the Bullet for My Valentine I had come to know. That said though, one thing of note about the album is the song Riot. If anybody remembers the introducing metal band skit that I made with the Random Gangsta back in the day that I've since re-uploaded on my channel after he decided to private most of his videos, that's the song he's listening to in the skit.
Are you ready? It's time for war. We'll break down these fucking doors.
Speaking of that video, remember when Demon Dog famously missed the point of it?
What you're saying is that only assholes recommend good bands like Slayer, Carcass, not...
That wasn't the point of that video!
Good times. The main highlight on Temper Temper is, of course, Tears Don't Fall Part 2.
Part 2! Part 2, part 2, part 2!
With how legendary the original song is, I guess it makes sense that they'd want to make a sequel that tries to recapture or even build off of what it had going for it.
Let's go again!
There's a comment I remember leaving on a Nick Nocturnal video reacting to the song that's one of my favorite comments I've ever left on any video that I'm going to read. This is basically if a movie has a sequel that's still watchable and good for what it is, but you know in your heart it doesn't totally stand up to the original. I was kind of thinking of Incredibles 2 when I wrote that, but I'm sure there are other movies that fit that description that I'll let you guys debate about. But that's kind of how I felt about Temper Temper in general from what I listened to. It wasn't bad, just underwhelming. Other noteworthy things that happened around this time was the single Raising Hell that came out in 2013 that I always thought was off Temper Temper, but it's actually a deluxe edition bonus track on Venom.
Every day since I'm running from the recall, kicking and screaming, I'm going to swinging.
And in early 2015, Jason J. James departed the band, with his replacement Jamie Mathias from a band called Revoker coming on board for Venom. As I said earlier, Venom was such an excellent way for Bullet to rebound after Temper Temper, and that's a big thing I found beautiful about that album. In a way, it kind of redeemed them and made it seem like it was worth it to have Temper Temper come out before it. It wasn't long before the band announced right before their US tour in 2016, which I saw in New York one night after the internship that I had at the time, which the shirt I'm wearing is of course from, that Michael Moose Thomas was going to sit the tour out while he and his wife gave birth to their first child, and had Jason Bold, who previously played with Tuck in a band called Axewound, filling in. Eventually he just ended up replacing Moose full-time, which was sort of a bummer to hear about because I really enjoyed his performances on the albums leading up to that point. After Venom came Gravity in 2018, which was way more polarizing than I remember Temper Temper being.
Wow, physics.
If that album didn't feel like a stretch from the classic Bullet sound, then this definitely did. On this album, the band took on a more alternative metal sound. It was actually fairly common for a lot of metalcore bands around this time to put out albums that had a more mainstream hard rock alternative metal sound than they're mainly known for, which gets referred to today as octanecore, named of course after the Sirius XM station that specializes in playing modern arena rock and metal. I'm not always a fan of when metalcore bands do this. It's pretty much the reason I stopped following Of Mice and Men's albums after Restoring Force, because I could tell this was the direction that they were going in, and it's also why I'm not big on That's the Spirit from Bring Me the Horizon. But I do think the sound worked okay on the newer albums from Parkway Drive and Wage War, even if I don't view them as being the best from either band. Gravity to me is somewhere in the middle of that. This album got a lot of shit in 2018 for how much of a departure it felt like. But do I hate this album?
No.
As I said in my Blink-182 video regarding the Matt Skiba albums, Gravity is one of those albums that isn't bad, but you could tell it would be better received if it were made by a different band. You don't listen to Bullet for My Valentine to hear alternative metal akin to a band like Disturbed or Papa Roach.
Not that there's anything wrong with that.
You listen to them for some eclectic melodic metalcore. And this is coming from someone who lists alternative metal as one of his favorite genres of music. But that's also why I don't have it in me to hate the sound on Gravity. If anything, I also kind of appreciate that it served as a way for Bullet to try something new and keep the creative juices flowing so they don't fall into the AC/DC effect, a common fear for most bands that have been around a long time. But at the end of the day, it, along with Temper Temper, are the objectively weakest albums in Bullet's discography. That said, the tracks I do recommend from Gravity are Over It, Letting You Go, Piece of Me, and Don't Need You. But guess what happened next? Much like Venom after Temper Temper, Bullet followed Gravity up with a much better album in 2021's Self-Titled. This is another thing I really admire about Bullet for My Valentine, how they're able to rebound after putting out an album that wasn't received well by the audience. I like comparing it to what happened after the first trailer for the Sonic movie came out and everyone hated Sonic's creepy humanoid design. They took the criticism and came back with something more fitting for what people were expecting. The Self-Titled might not be my favorite album of Bullet's, mostly because it's not as melodic and it's more scream-heavy and in line with general metalcore than I really know them to sound. But make no mistake, it is a thrashing album, arguably more so than Scream Aim Fire. Much like I said about Distance Over Time and A View from the Top of the World in my Dream Theater video, it's an album I view as being a good return to form for the band, and it has a sound I like hearing from them. The favorites for me on here are Parasite, Knives, No Happy Ever After, Bastards, which is not a Motorhead reference, and Death by a Thousand Cuts. Now, will they continue the pattern they've established of releasing a less than stellar album before putting out another good one, or will they try to keep a good streak going? The only valid answer is,
Let's find out.
By this point, I think you get what I mean when I said at the beginning that the narrative has changed about Bullet for My Valentine. The only complaints I tend to see being made about them nowadays mostly have to do with Temper Temper and Gravity, and maybe also finding the Self-Titled or even Venom to be somewhat safe compared to the first two albums. But back in the day, the narrative felt a lot different. So I thought real hard about what it was that made Bullet such a target for elitist drivel early on. Even tried to find some old forums to refresh myself with. And much like the case in both the Korn video and the Dream Theater video, I think it mostly boils down to them just being a metalcore band. But that didn't leave me satisfied. There must be more to it than that. I've already proven throughout this video that there was more than enough musically that was distinguishing the band from much of their contemporaries. Padge alone I think is enough to show that this isn't your typical metalcore band here. So by process of elimination, that must mean that the main issue lied in Matt Tuck's vocals. I guess that makes sense because Tuck is someone whose ratio between his clean vocals and his screams is much different than the vast majority of metalcore vocalists, mostly because he tends to be more clean focused, as I said earlier in the video. But wait, I thought it was the scream vocals that were seen as off-putting about this genre. Wouldn't that make Tuck the antithesis here? That would mean that apart from just not liking scream vocals in general, the issue would be with his cleans and how whiny and emo they sound. But frankly, I don't get that vibe at all from his voice. When I think of a whiny metalcore singer, I think of someone like Kellen Quinn of Sleeping with Sirens. A big part of why I have a hard time getting into them is because Kellen's high-pitched voice is a bit much for me, at least in this genre. It's always sounded somewhat artificial. And this isn't me saying I hate the dude or that I think he's a bad singer. He has done some quality features on other songs. I just find him to be a bit over the top as a singer. And I can understand if you might feel similarly about other vocalists in this genre. Matt Tuck, on the other hand, has this gruffness to his voice that matches the intensity of the riffs, and that's not a timbre you really associate with other metalcore vocalists. Nothing about his vocals strike me as over the top or whiny, rather I would say it's an overall unique approach. Nothing about the band strikes me as emo either, other than maybe the more sad lyrics they have. But as I've said before in my Korn video, all the term emo really boils down to in my eyes is lyrics that are really sad and personal, since emo is supposed to be short for emotional. But that concept transcends lots of different genres of music, including metal genres, which is why I don't really like using the term, even when I'm not describing lyrics. But even musically, there's a lot separating Bullet from the bands in pop punk and post-hardcore that typically get categorized as such. At the same time though, I could totally see Bullet as being a bridging gap between a band like My Chemical Romance, who already have a pretty technical edge on a handful of their songs, especially if Dead is anything to go by, while generally being associated with emo, post-hardcore, and pop punk, and having those sorts of vocal tendencies, and a band that's known to be a lot more aggressive and heavily guitar-driven, like, say, Megadeth. I don't believe that this bridging gap functionality necessarily makes Bullet a part of either of those genres by default, but it nonetheless makes their sound all the more dynamic and meaningful in my eyes. Obviously, if metalcore isn't your thing, that's okay, and I'm not here to chastise you for that. That's never been my intent, even back when videos on metal elitists were more frequent on my channel. It just strikes me as a weird and somewhat inconsistent standard to hold when Bullet breaks so many conventions and do as much as they do to stand out from the pack. Because that's the big thing that makes them my favorite metalcore band. While they do adhere to the basic tropes of the metalcore sound to be categorized as such, they aren't in the least bit generic. They do a lot to build off that sound, to the point where I would say they have a sound that they can call their own. I would even go as far as to say that a major aspect of why that is because compared to other metalcore bands, Bullet places more emphasis on the metal than they do the core. While I do hear some influence from them in a band like Within Sight, who I've shouted out before in my Why I Hate the Rock is Dead argument video, there really isn't a metalcore band that sounds like them. Metalcore is a genre that I find myself viewing as oversaturated these days, with so many bands popping up that don't do a whole lot to distinguish themselves from the bigger bands in the scene. Bullet for My Valentine also represents the peak of the metalcore sound, and an approach that I wish more bands of this style would take. And I think that plays a big part in how the narrative was able to turn around about them over the last decade or so. And strangely enough, that's also why Temper Temper and Gravity are seen as such disappointments, because we know they're capable of better. Everyone can say what they want about metalcore as a genre, but no matter how over the top the genre might get, no matter how played out the scene might feel, no matter if Killswitch Engage might be more influential and have the more definitive sound, for me, Bullet for My Valentine encapsulates everything I love about metalcore, and that's why they're always going to be a favorite of mine. So now here's the part at the end of the video where I ask you, the viewer, what's wrong with Bullet for My Valentine? Please be rational when leaving your thoughts in the comments down below, and by that I mean saying more than just everything. Hope you give your Valentine a good bullet of affection today. Thank you for watching this video, take care, and have a nice day. I'm Shades, and I'll see you next time.